Olá, boa noite, seja bem-vindo a mais um encontro nosso no 7 a 7, hoje dando continuidade à palestra que foi proferida por Tim Keller no Parlamento Britânico. Nós vamos refletir hoje sobre um outro aspecto da contribuição do cristianismo para as civilizações que foram influenciadas pela fé cristã. Como nós havíamos dito na semana passada, não existiu na história nenhuma civilização que nós podemos dizer essa é a pura expressão do cristianismo. Devido ao efeito do pecado na humanidade, o pecado afeta tudo, todos e todas as instituições. Diferente de algumas outras religiões, nós não temos um modelo sociopolítico para dizer que este é o modelo cristão. Porque o cristianismo age como um fermento, influenciando para o bem. Hoje, nesse trecho do vídeo, você vai perceber de que maneira a fé cristã afetou diretamente a relação com o outro e construiu uma civilização baseada na sensibilidade do outro. O apóstolo Paulo, quando escreve aos Romanos, no capítulo de número 13, nos diz o seguinte, entre os versículos 8 e 10. A ninguém fiqueis devendo coisa alguma, exceto o amor com que vos ameis uns aos outros, pois quem ama o próximo tem cumprido a lei. Pois isto, não adulterarás, não matarás, não furtarás, não cobiçarás, e se há qualquer outro mandamento, tudo nesta palavra se resume. Amarás o teu próximo como a ti mesmo. O amor não pratica o mal contra o próximo, de sorte que o cumprimento da lei é o amor. De que maneira o amor que está na essência da fé cristã se manifestou na construção de sua civilização ou ofereceu contribuição para a construção cultural do mundo ocidental como nós o conhecemos. Acompanhe este vídeo.
There's all kinds of scholarship going on now. I can only gesture in the direction. Brian Tierney of Cornell University and a whole lot of other people have shown that the idea of human rights, the idea of every human being being of equal dignity and worth, did not have come up out of the Enlightenment. It came up in the Middle Ages, and it actually came up out of Christian and biblical roots. For example, ancient cultures all accepted slavery, but the first person we know of ever that protested and said slavery is wrong per se, the institution is wrong per se, because human beings may not be sold because they are of infinite worth, was Gregory, the Bishop of Nyssa, who in the 370s preached a very famous sermon in which he said, now by the way, these are currencies I'm about to tell you, in which he said, how many obols for the image of God? How many staters did you get for selling the God-formed human being? For Jesus Christ, who knows the worth of human nature, has said an entire cosmos is not worthy to be exchanged for a human soul. Who, this is Gregory of Nyssa, who can buy a man or sell a man once you realize he's in the image of God? Now that idea, which was unique in the world at the time, he was the first person, the first voice to get up and say, no human being can be sold to another human being. That worked itself out. So, as Brian Tierney points, by the Middle Ages, this idea that every human being is made in the image of God began to develop the idea of inalienable human rights for everyone, no matter what the race, what the class, no matter what the social status. Martin Luther King Jr. perfectly talked about it when he says in his sermon, The American Dream, he says, you see, the founding fathers were really influenced by the Bible. The whole concept of the Imago Dei, the image of God, is the idea that all men have something within them that God injected. Not that they have substantial unity with God, but that every man has a capacity to have fellowship with God and thus gives him a uniqueness, it gives him a worth, it gives him dignity, and we must never forget this as a nation, speaking of the United States, of course, that there are no gradations in the image of God. Every human being, from a treble white to a bass black, is significant on God's keyboard precisely because every human being is made in the image of God. This is why we must fight segregation with all of our nonviolent might. A very different voice, Jürgen Habermas, says, the ideals of freedom, of conscience, human rights, and democracy is the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. The very idea of human rights then works itself out in a whole lot of different areas. David Bentley Hart, another scholar, talks about how our modern ideal of universal benevolence, helping the poor no matter where they are, helping the hungry no matter where they are, the whole idea of universal benevolence is a Christian idea that grew out of Christian roots. Dare I say something about sex? Yes, I dare. Kyle Harper, a great scholar of antiquity, writes in his great book, From Shame to Sin, that when Christianity started, the Roman world sex ethic was completely based on shame and honor. The sex ethic was completely based to hoist up the social order, the hierarchy. So if you were a man of high social status and you were married, you could have sex with whoever you want, your wife couldn't. And no woman of lower social status could ever deny sex demanded by any man of a higher social order. She could never deny it. Along comes Christianity, Kyle Harper says, in what he calls the first sexual revolution, and says all sex has to be consensual and covenantal. It has to be done by consent, mutual consent, in a covenant, and it was a revolution. Because the Christian idea, the other directed ethic of love started to work itself into every area. Sarah Williams is going to be here to talk later on about the fact that we're celebrating the women's rights and women's suffrage. But where do you see? Historical research will show that in the West, that had biblical roots, that had Christian roots. Okay, Christianity has not only been salt, it's been salt so massively. The ideals that we all take for granted right now are the fruit of the Bible and Christianity. And therefore, to even say, what can Christianity do for society now, is a little churlish. It's a little bit like saying, what have you done for me lately? But let's suggest this. In the past, Christianity has been like salt, bringing out the best in Western society. But in the future, it might be more of a way of preventing decay. It might be more of a preservative.